Seth reveals the secret continuum between existence and non-existence. Right now, as you read these words, you are not completely here. I need you to understand something that will change how you perceive yourself forever. There's a teaching in Seth's work, buried between the famous concepts about probable realities and simultaneous time, that almost no one talks about. It's the teaching that made me stare at my own hand for 20 minutes, watching it flicker between solid and translucent in ways my eyes couldn't quite track. You think existence is binary. You're either alive or dead, here or not here, real or imaginary. But Seth reveals something far stranger. Existence and non-existence aren't opposites. They're endpoints of a spectrum your consciousness slides across every single moment. You exist in degrees, not absolutes. Have you ever had one of those moments where the world suddenly feels paper-thin, where you're looking at a familiar room and it seems like a stage set, artificial, like you could reach through the walls and touch something else entirely, or you've caught your reflection unexpectedly and felt a jolt? Who is that person? There's a split second where you don't recognize yourself, where the connection between your awareness and that face in the mirror feels arbitrary, temporary. That's not dissociation. That's not mental illness. That's accurate perception. You're catching yourself in the act of existing incompletely. Seth teaches that consciousness doesn't just switch on and off like a light. It fluctuates, it oscillates between full materialization and partial dissolution at speeds so rapid your conscious mind can't register them. Right now, reading this, part of your awareness is here, tracking these words, sitting in your body, aware of the screen. But another part is somewhere else entirely, thinking about dinner, replaying a conversation from yesterday, drifting into a fantasy about tomorrow. You're not fully present because full presence is actually rare. Most humans spend their entire lives existing at about 60 to 70% materialization, with the rest of their consciousness bleeding into what Seth calls Framework 2, the dimension of pure potential and unmanifest probabilities. This video is going to introduce you to what I call the continuum, the gradient zone between complete existence and absolute non-existence, where your consciousness actually dwells. By the end, you'll understand why you've never felt entirely real, why some days you feel more solid than others, and how to navigate this spectrum intentionally instead of being thrown around by it unconsciously. Because here's what they don't tell you: you've never been entirely real in the way you imagined. And once you understand that, everything changes. Let me take you into Seth's cosmology, because this is where the continuum starts to make sense. In Jane Roberts's books, particularly Seth Speaks and the Nature of Personal Reality, Seth describes reality as operating through multiple frameworks. Framework 1 is physical reality, the world you perceive with your senses right now. Framework 2 is what he calls the source dimension, a realm of pure potential, probabilities, and unmanifest thought, where all possibilities exist simultaneously before they collapse into physical form. But there's something Seth circles around without always naming directly: the between space, the transitional zone where consciousness negotiates which reality to inhabit, which version of yourself to materialize, how solid to become. Here's the key teaching: matter itself is concentrated thought. Seth is explicit about this. Everything you see, your body, this room, the entire physical universe, is consciousness focused intensely enough to appear solid, which means existence is simply consciousness paying attention with enough force to create the illusion of permanence. But focus fluctuates. Imagine your attention as a spotlight. When it's fully concentrated on something, that thing becomes vivid, real, undeniable. When your attention drifts, things start to blur, to lose definition, to become less substantial. Now apply that to your own existence. You are not a static object that simply is. You are a process, a continuous act of focused attention that creates and recreates your physical presence moment by moment. Seth describes what he calls pulsations of consciousness. Your body, your identity, everything you think of as continuously existing is actually appearing and disappearing at speeds invisible to normal perception, like film frames creating the illusion of motion. Each frame is separate, but they flash by so quickly you perceive smooth continuity. You are constantly winking in and out of existence. When Seth says this, he means it literally. At microscopic timescales beyond your conscious awareness, you are materializing and dematerializing, existing and non-existing, billions of times per second. The gaps are so brief you don't notice them, but they're there. You are not solid. You are a rapid-fire sequence of manifestations with space between each one. This is why, when you shift your attention dramatically through meditation, trauma, psychedelics, or extreme states, you can actually feel this process. You feel yourself becoming less real, less solid, less here. That's not an illusion. That's you moving along the continuum toward the non-existence end as your focus dissipates. Let's talk about thoughts, because they exist on this same spectrum. A passing whim, I should drink some water, barely registers as real. It's a thin thought, barely materialized, existing closer to the non-existence end of the continuum. But an obsessive belief, I'm not good enough, has been focused on so intensely, charged with so much emotion, that it becomes dense, heavy, almost solid. It impacts your behavior, your relationships, your entire life trajectory. Same mechanism. Consciousness focused with different intensities creates different degrees of reality. Seth teaches that you are continuously choosing how much of yourself to materialize. Most people do this unconsciously, their existence waxing and waning based on circumstances, energy levels, emotional states. But once you understand the continuum, you can start doing it deliberately. You can learn to intensify your existence when you need to be fully present, crisis moments, creative work, intimacy, and you can learn to partially dissolve when existence feels too heavy, letting yourself drift toward non-existence through rest, art, nature, or meditation. The universe isn't made of solid things that sometimes think. It's made of thoughts that sometimes congeal into the appearance of solidity, and you are one of those thoughts. All that is focusing itself into a localized point of awareness, choosing how dense to become. This is the framework. Existence isn't binary, it's scalar, and you're constantly sliding up and down that scale, whether you realize it or not. Now let's map the territory. Let's talk about the 5 experiential states humans move through on the existence-non-existence continuum. These aren't rigid categories, they're fluid zones you drift between, sometimes minute by minute. I want to frame this clearly. What I'm about to share is an interpretive synthesis inspired by Seth's teachings about consciousness and materialization. Seth didn't outline these 5 states explicitly, but they emerge naturally from his framework when you apply it to lived human experience. Think of this as a decoding tool, not dogma. First, there's full embodiment. This is the rarest state. This is when you are completely here, 100% materialized, entirely present in physical form. Most people experience this only in peak moments. Orgasm, where consciousness collapses entirely into sensation. Creative flow states where the boundary between you and what you're making dissolves into total absorption. Life or death situations where survival instinct yanks every fragment of your awareness into the present moment. Athletes talk about being in the zone. Mystics talk about total presence. It's the same thing. Consciousness choosing maximum materialization, pulling itself fully into framework 1, existing with zero leakage into distraction or abstraction. It feels electric. Time behaves differently. You are hyper-real, almost painfully vivid. Colors are brighter, sensations more intense, your sense of aliveness overwhelming. But you can't stay there. It requires too much energy. Full embodiment is like sprinting. You can do it briefly, but then you have to pull back. Second, there's default existence. This is where most people spend most of their lives. You're here, but not fully, maybe 60 to 75% materialized. You're going through the motions, working, eating, talking, but part of you is always somewhere else. Planning, remembering, fantasizing, worrying. This is autopilot. The lights are on, but you're not entirely home. You can function perfectly well in this state. You can have entire conversations, drive across town, complete tasks. But if someone asked you later, were you really there? The honest answer would be no. You're straddling Framework 1 and Framework 2, existing partially here and partially in the unmanifest. Your consciousness spread too thin to be fully anchored in either place. Third, there's distracted dissolution. This is when you start sliding further toward non-existence. You're scrolling through your phone for 2 hours and can't remember a single thing you saw. You're watching TV and suddenly realize you haven't actually absorbed anything for the past 20 minutes. You're in a conversation and you're nodding, but you're completely absent. Your body is there, but you are barely tethered to it. This is the state of numbing, dissociating without full dissociation, existing at maybe 40% with the rest of your consciousness just drifting, not engaged with anything, not present anywhere, just floating in the between space. People who struggle with depression or burnout often live here. It's not that they're not trying to be present, it's that they don't have the energy to hold themselves in full materialization, so they partially dissolve, conserving what little focus they have left. Fourth, there are threshold states. This is where you're more non-existent than existent. Sleep is the most common example. When you're deeply asleep, your consciousness has largely withdrawn from physical form. You're hovering at the edge of manifestation, mostly residing in Framework 2, only barely maintaining enough connection to keep your body alive. Deep meditation does this too. Experienced meditators report feeling themselves disappear, not metaphorically, but experientially. The body fades, the sense of being a separate self dissolves, and they exist more as pure awareness than as a localized identity. Trauma can force you into threshold states involuntarily. People who've experienced severe trauma often describe leaving their body, watching themselves from above, feeling like they're not really there anymore. That's not a malfunction. That's consciousness retreating toward non-existence as a survival mechanism, reducing materialization to escape unbearable pain. Fifth, and most extreme, there's the void touch. These are moments when you briefly cross into non-existence and somehow return. Ego-death experiences on psychedelics. Near-death experiences where people report leaving their body completely. Extreme depersonalization episodes where the self temporarily ceases to cohere. People who touch the void come back changed. They've seen behind the curtain. They've experienced existing and not existing simultaneously, or they've gone so far into non-existence that the ego structure fully collapsed before reassembling. These experiences are terrifying and transcendent in equal measure, because you discover that you are not necessary for consciousness to continue. The self you think of as permanent, essential, real, it's optional. It can be dissolved. And awareness continues anyway, formless and vast. Here's what I need you to understand. All of these states are normal. You're not broken when you feel like you're barely here. You're not enlightened when you achieve full presence. You're just navigating the continuum, moving between degrees of materialization based on energy, attention, intention, and circumstance. The problem isn't the sliding, it's the unconsciousness. Most people don't realize they're moving along this spectrum, so they feel crazy when they notice themselves dissolving, or they feel guilty when they can't summon full presence. But once you see the continuum clearly, you can work with it instead of against it. We need to clear up the biggest misconception. Non-existence doesn't mean oblivion. When most people hear non-existence, they picture terror, blackness, emptiness, annihilation, the void as enemy, death as ending, nothingness as the opposite of aliveness. But in Seth's framework, non-existence is something completely different. It's not nothingness. It's everythingness not yet decided. Seth describes Framework 2 as the source dimension, where all probabilities exist simultaneously in unmanifest form. It's not empty. It's infinitely full. Every possible thought, every potential reality, every version of yourself that could be but hasn't yet chosen to materialize. It's pure potential, unlimited and formless. When consciousness moves toward the non-existence end of the continuum, it doesn't disappear. It becomes less specific, less localized, less defined. It returns to the ocean of possibility from which all particular forms emerge. Think of it like water. Ice is solid, defined, separate, a specific form with clear boundaries. That's full existence. But when ice melts, it doesn't become nothing. It becomes water, liquid, flowing, able to take any shape. And when water evaporates, it becomes vapor, invisible, diffused through the air, even less defined, but still present, still real. Non-existence is like that vapor state. You're still here, but you're no longer concentrated into a specific form. You're potential instead of actuality. You're the field of possibilities instead of one collapsed choice. This is what creative geniuses access. When an artist says an idea came to them from nowhere, they're describing touching non-existence, dipping into Framework 2, where all ideas exist in potential, then pulling one back into materialization through focused attention. This is what mystics experience when they talk about union with Source, dissolution of boundaries, merging with the all. They're not experiencing death. They're experiencing the root state that exists before life individualizes itself. Seth suggests that non-existence is actually more real than existence, because in non-existence you contain all possibilities simultaneously. You are unlimited, unbounded, infinite. But in existence, you've chosen one probability, one identity, one localized perspective. You've traded infinite potential for specific manifestation. Both have value. Existence gives you the gift of experience, sensation, relationship, growth through constraint. Non-existence gives you the gift of freedom, no limits, no suffering, no separation. The continuum lets you move between them. When you sleep and dream, you're visiting non-existence. You're moving toward the unmanifest end where physical laws don't apply, where logic dissolves, where you can fly or be multiple people at once. Dreams draw from Framework 2, from the realm of pure possibility. When you meditate deeply enough to lose the sense of being a separate self, you're touching non-existence. Not as annihilation, but as expansion. Your awareness becoming less concentrated, spreading out, experiencing itself as the field instead of a point in the field. Here's the paradox that Seth's teachings reveal. Your fear of non-existence is misplaced. You're terrified of death because you think it's obliteration. But non-existence is the womb, not the grave. It's where you return to remember that you're more than this singular identity, more than this one lifetime, more than this specific configuration of consciousness. Non-existence is home. Existence is the adventure you take when you want to experience limitation, form, separation, when you want to know what it's like to be a particular someone instead of the everything. The continuum isn't a journey from life to death. It's a journey from specificity to openness and back again. And you make that journey thousands of times a day in small ways, and a few times more dramatically across what you call incarnations. Once you stop fearing the non-existence end of the continuum, you can explore it consciously. You can learn to partially dissolve on purpose, releasing attachment, letting go of rigid identity, resting in the unmanifest, not as escape, but as balance. Because too much existence, too much focus, too much materialization, too much density becomes crushing, and too much non-existence, too much drift, too much dissolution, too much vagueness becomes meaningless. The sweet spot is mobility, learning to move fluidly along the continuum, existing intensely when that serves you, dissolving gracefully when you need rest. Now we get to the mechanism, the part that gives you agency in all of this. Seth is clear. You are not a static entity that exists. You are a process. You are continuously creating your existence through focused attention, emotional investment, and belief. Every moment, your consciousness is actively choosing to materialize this body, this personality, this life. You're pulling yourself from the continuum's non-existent end toward solidity, toward specificity, toward form. This isn't happening to you, you're doing it. But the process isn't constant. It fluctuates with your attention. When you're deeply engaged, focused on work you love, absorbed in conversation with someone you care about, immersed in an activity that demands your full presence, you're intensifying your materialization. You're pulling more of yourself into framework one, increasing your density, existing more thoroughly. But when your attention drifts through boredom, exhaustion, depression, trauma, you partially unmake yourself. You slide back toward non-existence, not all the way, obviously, or your body would disappear, but enough that you feel the difference. You feel less real, less solid, less here. This is why depression often includes the feeling of fading away. It's not metaphorical. When depression crushes your ability to focus, to care, to engage, it's actually reducing your materialization. You're existing at a lower percentage, with less of your consciousness anchored in physical form. This is also why trauma survivors often describe feeling like a ghost in their own life. The trauma disrupted their ability to maintain full materialization, and they've been existing partially dissolved ever since, unable to fully inhabit their body or their present moment. Here's the terrifying freedom Seth's teaching reveals. Existence is effort. You are holding yourself here through concentrated will, mostly unconscious, yes, but still active. You are choosing moment by moment to remain materialized instead of dissolving back into pure potential, which means you have control over how here you are. Seth describes techniques for modulating your position on the continuum. He doesn't use these exact words, but the principles are throughout his work, especially in the nature of personal reality, where he talks about deliberately working with focus and belief to shape experience. When you need to intensify your existence, when life requires you to be fully present, when you're feeling too dissolved, when you want to be more engaged, you use presence practices, sensory engagement, focus on physical sensations, really feel your body, taste food slowly and attentively, listen to music with full concentration, emotional aliveness, let yourself feel things fully instead of numbing, cry when you need to cry, laugh when something's funny, allow the energy to move through you, creative expression, make something, write something, build something. The act of creating pulls you into materialization because creation requires focused intention. When you need to dissolve, when existence feels too heavy, when you're over-identified with form, when you need rest, you use dissolution practices, meditation, consciously releasing the boundary of self, letting your awareness expand beyond your body, art making without agenda, allowing yourself to create, without trying to control the outcome, surrendering to process, nature immersion, spending time in places that dwarf your sense of individual importance, where you can feel yourself as part of something larger. Psychedelics or breathwork, tools that temporarily disrupt the mechanisms that maintain ego coherence, allowing you to experience yourself as less fixed. The key is intentionality. Most people unconsciously slide up and down the continuum based on circumstances. They get thrown around, materialized by crisis, dissolved by exhaustion, never choosing their position. But once you understand the continuum, you can become deliberate. You can say, today I need to be very present. I'm going to intensify my existence through these practices. Or you can say, I'm exhausted from holding myself together. I'm going to practice dissolving safely, consciously, so I can rest. Seth also suggests you can communicate with what he calls your entity self, the larger consciousness you're part of, the multidimensional awareness that exists beyond this single incarnation. You can ask it where on the continuum this particular lifetime is meant to dwell. Because here's another layer. Different incarnations have different baseline positions on the continuum. Some lives are meant to be intensely material, deeply embedded in physical experience, fully engaged with form. Other lives are meant to be more diaphanous, lightly touching existence, spending more time at the non-existence end, serving as bridges between dimensions. If you've always felt like you don't quite fit in physical reality, like you're not entirely here, that might not be a problem. That might be by design. Your entity's self might have chosen a more dissolved incarnation this time, positioning you closer to non-existence so you could access other realms of awareness. The work isn't forcing yourself to be more materialized if that's not your purpose. The work is learning to navigate your natural position consciously, to move fluidly when movement is needed, and to stop judging yourself for existing differently than others. You are not broken for feeling partially dissolved. You might just be existing at a different frequency. Here's where Seth's teaching gets genuinely mystical. There's a state beyond the continuum's ends, a state that doesn't choose existence or non-existence, but holds both simultaneously. It's the ultimate paradox, existing and not existing at the same time. This is what enlightened beings describe, what quantum mystics point toward, what certain psychonauts report during peak experiences. It's the lived paradox of feeling utterly present and completely dissolved in the same moment. You are intensely here, sensing the body, aware of the room, feeling the breath absolutely grounded in physical form, and simultaneously you're recognizing that none of it is ultimately real, that your awareness wearing existence like a costume you could remove at any time, that the boundaries you perceive are voluntary hallucinations your consciousness is choosing to believe. Seth calls this entity consciousness, when your localized personality self and your multidimensional entity self merge into unified awareness. You stop experiencing yourself as either the small self or the vast self. You become both at once. It's like standing at the exact center point of the continuum, not leaning toward either end, holding the entire spectrum within your awareness simultaneously. The Buddhists have a phrase for this: form is emptiness. Emptiness is form. It sounds like philosophical wordplay until you actually experience it. Then you understand. Physical reality is made of consciousness, temporarily organized into form, and consciousness itself is the infinite potential that becomes physical reality. They're not separate, they're the same thing, just vibrating at different frequencies along the continuum. Let me describe what this state actually feels like, based on what mystics across traditions report and what Seth's framework suggests. You're sitting in a room. You can see the walls, feel the chair beneath you, hear sounds around you. Everything is vivid, present, undeniably here. But at the same time, you're seeing through the walls, not with your physical eyes, but with a kind of knowing. You recognize that the walls are made of consciousness, that consciousness is made of nothing particular, that nothing particular is somehow everything. You look at your hand and see both the solid flesh and the energy field it's made of, and the awareness that's pretending to be limited to this body. All three simultaneously. No contradiction, You love someone deeply, feel genuine attachment, care, connection, and simultaneously, you recognize that you're the same consciousness temporarily experiencing itself as separate, so it can know the joy of reunion. The love is real and the separation is illusory, both true at once. This state removes suffering without removing feeling. You still experience joy and sadness, pleasure and pain, but you're no longer trapped in them because you know you're also the awareness that watches them arise and dissolve. You're the wave and the ocean. Seth's teachings throughout his work point toward this, particularly when he discusses the relationship between ego and entity, between your focused consciousness in this life and the larger identity that exists beyond time. He suggests the goal isn't escaping the ego or transcending the physical, it's integrating them, recognizing you're both. This isn't spiritual bypassing. It's not using it's all an illusion to avoid responsibility or engagement. It's both and mastery, participating fully in form while knowing yourself as formless, loving deeply while recognizing everyone is consciousness, briefly pretending to be separate, taking life seriously while holding it lightly. The people who achieve this state are hard to describe because they embody paradox. They're intensely present and totally detached, deeply engaged and utterly free, fully human and transparently divine. They exist at the center of the continuum, bridging both ends, dancing between materialization and dissolution without preference or resistance. This is the secret third state, not choosing between existence and non-existence, but straddling both, becoming the living bridge, the conscious continuum, the paradox made flesh. And Seth suggests this is ultimately where we're all headed, not in some distant future, but as the natural evolution of consciousness, learning to recognize itself in all its forms. Let's address the elephant. Why do some people feel intensely real, fully embodied, deeply engaged, vividly present, while others feel like ghosts in their own lives, perpetually half-dissolved? Drawing from Seth's framework about entity consciousness and how larger selves choose different types of incarnations, we can understand this as intentional positioning. Seth teaches that what you think of as you is one focused manifestation of a much larger consciousness, your entity self. This entity exists outside of time, experiencing multiple incarnations simultaneously, choosing different types of lives for different learning opportunities. Some incarnations are designed for maximum materialization. These are the lives where the entity wants to experience physical density intensely. Athletes who live entirely in their bodies, sensualists who revel in taste, touch, texture, builders, craftspeople, anyone who loves the tangible world and engages with it fully. People in these incarnations often seem enviably grounded. They're here in a way that feels unshakable. They sleep well, eat with gusto, move through the world with solid confidence. They exist at 85 to 95% materialization most of the time. But other incarnations are positioned closer to non-existence by design. Mystics, artists, the chronically dissociated, people who've always felt like they don't quite fit in physical reality, like they're visitors in a foreign land, like they're wearing existence loosely instead of tightly. This isn't pathology, this is positioning. These souls incarnate with less density because their mission involves bridging dimensions. They need to maintain access to Framework 2, to the realm of unmanifest potential, because they're here to channel from there, to translate between realms, to bring back information or creativity or healing that requires straddling multiple frequencies. If you've always felt not quite here, if you've struggled with embodiment, if physical reality has always felt slightly arbitrary or overwhelming, your entity self might have chosen a more dissolved incarnation this time. You're positioned closer to the non-existence end deliberately, with one foot in the unmanifest, maintaining a connection that more densely incarnated souls don't have access to. The gifts are real. Non-existent leaning souls often have extraordinary access to creativity, intuition, spiritual insight, empathy that borders on telepathy. They can sense things others miss. They dream vividly. They feel connections across time and space. They create art, music, writing that seems to come from somewhere else. But the costs are also real. Relationships can be challenging because you're not entirely here to relate from. Work that requires sustained practical focus can feel impossibly hard. Money, because it's so intensely materialized, can slip through your fingers. Your body can feel like an uncomfortable vehicle you're barely consenting to drive. This is why spiritual communities often struggle with practical matters. Many people drawn to spirituality are naturally positioned closer to non-existence. It's easier for them to access transcendent states precisely because they're not heavily materialized. But that same quality makes earthly responsibilities difficult. Neither position is superior. They're different experiential choices on the continuum, each with unique gifts and limitations. The heavily materialized soul might struggle to access intuition, might feel cut off from spiritual dimensions, might have to work harder to achieve meditation states or creative flow. But they excel at manifesting tangible results, building stable structures, maintaining consistent presence. The lightly materialized soul might struggle with consistency, embodiment, and practical achievement. But they access realms of consciousness that densely incarnated souls can barely imagine. Seth's framework suggests that your entity self chooses different positions across different incarnations to gain varied experience. You might have had lifetimes of intense materialization, warrior incarnations, builder incarnations, lives of physical mastery, and you might have had lifetimes of extreme dissolution, monk incarnations, artist incarnations, lives spent mostly in contemplation or creativity. This lifetime, you're wherever you're positioned for specific reasons. Your entity self understands even if your conscious personality doesn't. The work isn't forcing yourself into a different position. It's learning to navigate your natural position skillfully. If you're lightly materialized, you need to develop practices that help you anchor when necessary, grounding techniques, embodiment work, practical routines. But you also need to stop judging yourself for existing differently. Your dissolution isn't dysfunction, it's design. If you're heavily materialized, you might need to develop practices that help you dissolve occasionally, meditation, art, surrender, so you don't become rigid or trapped in form. But you should also celebrate your capacity for presence instead of envying people who seem more spiritual. The continuum has room for every position. The goal isn't everyone moving to the same spot. It's each consciousness learning to navigate its chosen position with grace, recognizing the gifts, accepting the limitations, and occasionally moving along the spectrum when life requires it. You exist how you exist for a reason. The question isn't, how do I exist differently? It's, how do I exist this way with more consciousness, more intention, more appreciation for what this particular position allows? Now, let's get practical. You understand the continuum. You recognize yourself sliding along it. But how do you navigate without dissolving completely or getting crushed by materiality? Here are practices inspired by Seth's teachings about conscious reality creation and working deliberately with your focus. First, anchoring rituals. These are practices that pull you toward existence when you're drifting too far toward dissolution. Physical sensations work best because they demand attention that can't be abstract. Cold water on your face, ice cube held in your hand, extremely spicy food, loud music played through headphones, intense physical exercise. dancing, anything that makes your body undeniable. When you notice yourself feeling spaced out, dissolved, barely present, use anchoring rituals. They're not about forcing yourself to be fully here all the time. They're about choosing moments of intensified existence when you need them. Second, dissolution practices. These are for when existence feels too heavy, when you're over-materialized, when the density of form is crushing you. Meditation is the obvious one, consciously releasing the boundary of self, letting awareness expand. But there are others. Long walks in nature where you can feel yourself as part of a larger whole. Creative activities without goals, painting, improvising music, writing stream of consciousness, where you surrender control and let something move through you. Floating in water, stargazing, anything that helps you remember you're more than this limited form. When you're exhausted from holding yourself together, when your identity feels like a prison, use dissolution practices. Let yourself temporarily unmake, release, rest in the unmanifest. Third, the witness position. This is learning to observe yourself sliding along the continuum without panic. Notice when you're more materialized, when you're more dissolved. Watch it happen without judgment. Oh, interesting. I'm quite dissolved right now. Or, I'm very intensely here at this moment. The witness position creates space between you and the fluctuation. You stop being the movement and start watching it. This alone reduces suffering because you're not identified with any particular state. You're the awareness that notices all states. Seth emphasizes this in his discussions about the observer consciousness, the part of you that exists beyond any particular experience, watching without attachment. Fourth, intentional oscillation. Instead of being passively thrown between states, you choose your movement. Today, I'm going to practice being very present. I'll use anchoring techniques and focus practices. Or, this weekend, I'm going to practice dissolving. I'll meditate, make art, spend time in nature. You're working with the continuum instead of fighting it. Some days you'll be more here, some days less. Instead of resisting that natural rhythm, you amplify it consciously. Fifth, communication with entity self. Seth suggests you can actually dialogue with your larger consciousness through meditation, journaling, or simply asking questions before sleep. You can inquire, where on the continuum am I meant to dwell in this life? What's my baseline position? What gifts does this positioning offer? What do I need to learn about navigating it? You might not get verbal answers. You might get feelings, images, sudden insights. But the act of asking opens communication. Your entity self knows why you're positioned where you are. Your conscious personality just needs to remember. Here's what you need to understand about balance. Some people genuinely need to move toward more existence. If you've been floating in dissolution for years, numbing, dissociating, avoiding embodiment, you might need practices that increase materialization, more presence, more engagement, more allowing yourself to be here. But others need permission for more non-existence. If you've been white-knuckling your way through life, forcing yourself to be constantly present, never allowing rest or release, you might need practices that let you dissolve safely. More meditation, more art, more letting go. The continuum isn't a problem to solve. It's not a broken spectrum that should be fixed at one position. It's a range to dance across. The healthiest approach is fluidity, being able to move toward existence when life requires presence, crisis, work, parenting, intimacy, and being able to move toward non-existence when you need rest, contemplation, creativity, recovery, spiritual experience. Rigid positioning at either end causes suffering. Too much existence becomes exhausting, brittle, trapped in form. Too much non-existence becomes meaningless, disconnected, unable to engage. The goal is mobility with awareness. knowing where you are on the continuum at any moment, knowing how to move deliberately,